This is the Asia Trade. I'm Avril Hong in Singapore.
I'm Haidi, Stroud-Watts in Sydney. The top stories this hour.
Combat operations continue at this time in full force, and they will continue until all of our objectives are achieved.
The escalating Middle East war posing a fresh test for global markets. Iran's supreme leader confirmed killed, leaving a power vacuum in Tehran. The first US casualties reported as President Trump says bombing may continue for weeks. Oil prices in focus as Asian trading begins, with Iran saying tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz largely at a halt. The Aussie dollar is leading risk currencies lower. And the war is spreading across the Middle East, with Iranian missiles hitting Israel, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain and Kuwait, while airspace closures cause travel chaos. All right, let's get straight to the latest. Let's bring our team, the China Show co-anchor David Inglis, watching these markets for us as Asia wakes up in Hong Kong. In Washington, we have Bloomberg Balance of Power co-anchor Kayleigh Lyons and our Deputy UAE Bureau Chief, Baer Abu Ahmad, joins us from London as well. We appreciate all of your time with us. Dave, let me start off with you. From the outset, it looks like a nightmarish scenario, obviously, for energy markets, for risk assets. So much still depends on duration and what happens from here.
Absolutely, and I think it's too early to be able to extrapolate how long oil will remain at these levels. But I think the headline number at this point is the world needs to know that we are opening up above $80 a barrel on Brent. So we closed at just under 73. This is an initial 10 to 11, even 12% move higher in terms of the Brent price right now. I'm just looking across not just the May contract, which is now trading at 81. Across the curve, we are up clearly across the curve. It's really the near-end contract that's seeing the most substantial moves to the upside. Although, as I speak, and this is important, as I speak, we are pairing the initial move higher, this knee-jerk reaction in markets, just to note that as well. Now, just a caveat too, this is no indication that we did see the peak in oil prices at the get-go. Other things we're tracking, gold, that's also coming up right now. I'm looking at my screens right now, and we're looking at gold futures now trading at 53.40 on gold. Spot gold is also very much in focus. And just keep in mind, in terms of the all-time highs on spot itself, we just under 55. So we're nowhere near those levels, but substantially higher than we were trading on Friday going into this weekend. And as you can see, precious metals are bid, U.S. futures are down, and it does seem that markets will really need some support right now. Broad move cross asset is one clearly of risk aversion, guys.
For markets, as you guys mentioned, is really going to be about the duration of this conflict. Kayleigh, let's bring you in here. Are we getting any indication from the Trump administration how long this might last? There's been some suggestion that it might be for 4 weeks. Is this realistic to expect?
Well, that's what the president told the Daily Mail, that he expects that this could be about a 4-week-long operation, as he told the nation once again in a video statement posted to Truth Social this afternoon before departing his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida to return back here to Washington. He says these operations will continue until, quote, all of our objectives are achieved. The difficulty at this hour is that there is not a clear understanding of what exactly those objectives are. Is the U.S. simply trying to take out Iran's ballistic missile capabilities? Is this about targeting the nuclear program, or is this actually about regime change, knowing that this has been to some degree a decapitation strike as well, taking out the supreme leader? And in that same video, the president called on the Iranian people. He says, if you yearn for freedom, seize this moment, be brave, be bold, take back your country. He suggested that he fulfilled a promise to the American people in taking this, or the Iranian people rather, in taking this action. But he says, quote, the rest will be up to you, though he noted that the U.S. will be there to help. And that is going to be a question as well, even once active combat operations have wrapped up. And again, that could be a matter of days. It could be weeks, perhaps longer. What role will the U.S. still be playing going forward? And what role will Congress have to play, if any, in that? As we have spoken within the last hour here on Bloomberg TV and radio to members of Congress from both parties who are on conflicting sides as to whether or not a war powers vote is necessary for the president to continue to authorize the military to be used in this way. Democrats contend that it was unconstitutional to launch these strikes in the first place, that the president does need to consult and get the approval of Congress for them to continue, while Republicans largely are supportive of this president and his actions. So it's unclear whether or not it actually is something that could pass. But that is still going to be a conversation that dominates here in Washington in the weeks ahead as the president warns that more American casualties could be coming.
Kaylee, there are just so many questions. The most important ones you've canvassed there as to what comes next. You know, what exactly is that U.S. presence and role going to be going forward beyond this initial strike? But, Baer, I do wonder from where you sit, do we know what is going on in Iran, what is happening when it comes to succession of leadership, when it comes to, you know, the people that President Trump are calling on to kind of seize the moment?
Yeah, hi. So, I mean, as of now, the way things stand is a succession plan is not in place, right? There is no clear successor yet. But the body that President Trump said he will talk to, he told The Atlantic earlier today that he will talk to Iran. That body is comprised of the president, the head of judiciary in Iran, and a jurist from the Guardian Council. So those three members are now running the country. But even with that, I brought to the table before this attack that came against Oman. Now, the Gulf countries have been facing this relentless retaliation from Iran over the past 48 hours. But Oman in particular is interesting because it is the country that has been mediating these talks between the U.S. and Iran over the past couple of weeks. Only 2 days ago, they were sat at the table. But what the president of Iran, what the foreign minister of Iran had come out and said is that right after that attack against Iran, against Oman that happened earlier in the Duqm port, he said that he assured his counterpart in Oman that was not something they were aware of, that was the armed forces acting in somewhat of an isolation. So you've got that risk of the armed forces in Iran acting in isolation. But what we also know is that President Trump's demands or President Trump's urging of the Iranian people to stand against their government haven't yet materialized. So once Khamenei has been confirmed to be dead in the early hours of this morning, a lot of people came out in mass protests in Iran. Some people were coming out in jubilation. Some other people were mourning his death. But what we haven't seen is President Donald Trump's demands or President Donald Trump's urging of the Iranian people to go up and go against the government happening on the ground or coming to fruition.
Baer, what do we know about the sort of military assets that Iran has at this stage and how long they can keep up all this military action for?
So one thing that is a consensus on the ground, and particularly when it comes to the Gulf states, is what we've seen over the past 48 hours is certainly not the 12-day war that we've seen in June. The attacks that Iran have launched against members of the GCC, those include the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, against what was more than just military bases, U.S. military bases. We've seen Iran targeting civilian infrastructure. I mean, you're seeing the images there. I think that is in Dubai, in some of the affluent neighborhoods in Dubai. What we know is that perhaps President Donald Trump's and Israel's attack against Iran came at a time where they thought that Iran was not as prepared for this war. But what we're seeing, the retaliation, just the numbers that we've seen being launched in missiles and drones against GCC countries have been palpable. Hundreds of missiles launched against them, but we don't know for sure what Iran's left-in capabilities is.
Kaylee, I'm so curious as to how this is playing out in the U.S., both when it comes to the popular vote. We know that President Trump has been struggling with approvals both within his base and also more broadly. How does this play into his campaign promises of no more wars, of more isolationist foreign policy, and of getting inflation down just ahead of the summer driving season? We could see gas prices spike.
Yeah, it was just last Tuesday the president in his State of the Union address was touting low gasoline prices. And clearly with the big move we're seeing in oil futures at the opening of trading here, that is likely something that is going to change in the near term. Now, we know that President Trump is not able to seek re-election himself, but this is going to be a major factor for his party heading into these midterm elections. For Republicans, especially those who are in vulnerable seats that could swing either way, who have to defend the economic track record of this administration. So much economically and in terms of oil is going to be really how this a deciding factor into how this plays politically. I would note that when we consider what the U.S. military has been undertaking over the last 24, 48 hours, in part, and the president has said this, they are targeting Iran's Navy. We have already sunken 9 Iranian naval vessels. The president said we will continue until the Navy is taken out entirely. And the suggestion, if you speak to analysts, is that that actually may be an action intended to make sure that the Strait of Hormuz can continue to be navigable for oil cargoes. We know 1/5 of them, in terms of the oil flows around the world, go through the Strait of Hormuz. So that may be the U.S. trying to make sure that there is some insulation so that oil prices and the way in which that impacts politics here at home are somewhat insulated.
Kaylee,
Dave,
really great to have you with us.
On that note, what are you expecting, just very quickly, Dave, on the energy-related stocks, the shipping-related counters in trade today as well?
Yeah, well, those two stories actually come together in one sector, right? Transport, airlines. In fact, very early, Auckland Airport is off 3 or 4%. Qantas is already down. That's really on flight cancellations, disruptions, and the move up in oil prices. So we're looking at that broad cohort of transport, airline, shipping-related names across the Asia-Pacific. Obviously, precious metals will be very much in focus today, given, of course, the pop we're seeing in precious metals. Just to note, in case your viewers are just joining us right now, U.S. futures are opening lower this Monday morning, and likely will be the case when you look at Japan, that comes online in about 15 minutes or so. Back to you guys.
China Show co-anchor David Inglis there ahead of a very, very busy day for markets. Our Bloomberg Balance of Power co-anchor Kaylee Lyons and our Deputy UAE Bureau Chief Baer Abu Omar there with the latest. Let's continue with this discussion with our next guest. Douglas Silliman is the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He's also a former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait. Really great to have you with us. And I guess from the outset, I wanted to get your reactions as to how this played out, because in a lot of ways it was kind of very typical of a Donald Trump surprise. Even as these bilateral talks were still happening from Geneva, we're expecting more US-Iran talks going into this week. The strikes began to happen. Do you think that there is a plan for further objectives to be met? And what are those objectives when it comes to potential regime change?
Heidi, I think those are both very good questions. And I want to say thank you to all the viewers of Bloomberg TV. I'm very happy to be back on Bloomberg. I think one of the things that President Trump has got to define for himself, and preferably for the country as well, is the goals that he hopes to achieve in Iran. He has talked just in the past couple of days about regime change, about possible discussions with the remaining parts of the Iranian government. So it is very difficult for the Iranian side to actually understand what it is that President Trump is asking of them. I also fear that the Israeli government has a different set of goals for the operation in Iran. And I think there are many in the Israeli government who would prefer to see a collapse of the government and disarray in Iran as a way to postpone or do more damage to Iran's desire to destroy Israel in the long term. Maybe the most concerning for me is that I think now that the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has been killed in U.S. and Israeli airstrikes, you may see that the attitude and the goal of the remaining Iranian regime is to cause as much damage to the United States, to Israel, and potentially to the region as is possible. With the basic idea, if we are going down, we are going to take as many people down with us as we can, unless they can reestablish control across the country, which is probably what a lot of the people are thinking about doing right now at the top of the Iranian government.
We've talked about Iran really wanting to widen retaliation. We've also heard from Benjamin Netanyahu saying that Israeli strikes will intensify in the following days, and we're getting lines from the IDF at the moment, Douglas, commenting on projectiles in a Telegram post, really saying that they have seen things like sirens sounding out in Israel, projectiles being launched from Lebanon as well. How much risk do you assign regionally at this point when it comes to everything that's happening at the moment? And can any kind of cohesive way forward be shaped without further US intervention? We know that there's not much appetite for boots on the ground, but do you see that as a risk going forward?
I see it as a risk, but with President Trump, probably a very small risk. I do not think he's going to want to put American boots on the ground in Iran. What I think is going to happen, and what you will see from the American and Israeli military in the coming days, is essentially circling around a whole set of different Iranian target sets: ballistic missile storage sites, ballistic missile launchers, drone storage sites, factories that make both command and control centers for the military, the Navy, the Revolutionary Guards. And it will be the responsibility of the American and the Israeli militaries, the air forces and the navies, to degrade these gradually. The real question is going to be, who is going to run out of ammunition first? For Israel, for the Gulf states, they have taken a lot of Iranian rockets. The Emirati government, when they announced today that they were going to close their embassy in Tehran, said that Iran had fired 200 drones and 137 ballistic missiles at the UAE. The UAE had successfully countered most of them. But how much longer can this go on? How many more long-range, short-range ballistic missiles and drones does Iran have? How many can Israel and the United States degrade before they are fired? And how many more air defense munitions does Israel and do the GCC countries have to defend themselves against these huge salvos of rockets coming from Iran?
Ambassador, it seems like, to your point, the Iranian approach is to inflict as much damage as possible at this stage, even at the expense of all these other Gulf states that in the first place might not have wanted any military conflict. What are the risks for Iran strategically in such an approach in terms of further alienating some of these Gulf countries?
Well, if the main Israeli and American goal for this conflict is to achieve capitulation by the Iranian government, the risks to the Iranian government, the Islamic Revolutionary government, are really quite small. If the goal is to get rid of them, there's probably very little that they can do to convince Israel or the United States to keep them in place. So I think that the strategy of maximum damage against particularly the United States in an election year, as was just discussed in your program, may be their best strategy to increase American popular opposition to the war. I think right now, and one of the things your reporter earlier mentioned, that Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi mentioned that many units of the Iranian military and Revolutionary Guards were operating independently now based on instructions that were given to them a week, 2 weeks, 10 days ago. This shows, one, that I think they have lost a lot of their command and control, but two, you may see some attacks against civilian infrastructure, like the attacks against Duqm port in Oman, that were actually not intended at the beginning. Araghchi's comments were essentially an apology to Oman after Oman had mediated this last 2 rounds of talks. So I think it is going to be difficult for the Iranian regime to regain complete control of all of their military, but that is going to be one of their main goals going forward.
Douglas, I know that you said that the risk of boots on the ground, American boots on the ground, was low, but I'll put it to you this way. Do you think there can be meaningful regime change without that level of intervention?
Well, what is more important is, does Donald Trump believe that there can be meaningful regime change without boots on the ground? And the answer is, I frankly don't know. The pre-recorded message that he sent to the world and to the American people just as the attack started yesterday essentially said that he wanted the Iranian people to take regime change into their own hands, for them to get their country back. There does not appear to be much specific that the United States can do to help Iranians do that, other than to degrade the security services and their ability to prevent Iranians from going into the streets to protest. I will also notice that Iran is going to be very divided. You have seen in the past 24 hours both demonstrations mourning the death of Ayatollah Khamenei and demonstrations celebrating the death of the Ayatollah. I think Iran will be a very divided society, and it's a society in which it will be very difficult for a non-majority popular movement to take control of a government which still has all the guns in its hands.
Especially with these internet blackouts that we're hearing in the country, how do you organize an opposition? Ambassador, it's been great to chat. Thank you so much for your insights. Douglas Silliman is president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait. Quick look at markets. We're seeing oil suddenly catching a bid, jumping by the most in about 4 years, which was, of course, since the start of the war in Ukraine, although that 12-13% pop at the open is being pared back slightly on Brent crude futures. U.S. stock futures are down, gold also catching a bid. Now, as we unpack further the fallout from the Iran strikes, the Nuclear Threat Initiative warns that Washington will face many challenges in the coming weeks as a result of the war. One of the most consequential is the risk that Iran's nuclear materials and technology may no longer be secure if the regime collapses. Joining us now is the initiative's co-chair and former U.S. Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz. Really good to see you, Ernest. First off, maybe talk to us about, when it comes to the events over the weekend, the death of the Ayatollah, the extent in which there not being any clear Iranian leadership at this stage. Does it make things more dangerous as far as Iran's nuclear assets are concerned?
Well, I think there is an unfortunate likely retreat from any possibility of getting the international inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency back in the country. And that was certainly essential following the military activity of last June. I've said many times that, to me, I would be putting first priority on understanding the fate of the 60% enriched uranium. I think it has not been emphasized enough that that material actually could be directly used in a nuclear explosive device. We don't know where it is. It's thought that some of it certainly may still be deep in Isfahan, covered with rubble, but we also don't know if much of it was moved away. So I think a lot of the focus on enrichment is understandable, but if they have a lot of that 60% uranium still in their possession, presumably hidden somewhere, the reality is they could make a nuclear explosive without further enrichment. So I think that's number one. But number two is, clearly no one knows how this is going to end, really, or when it's going to end. But when it does, I think our priority has to be to get the IAEA, the international inspectors, back into Iran with the full set of tools that they had before President Trump tore up the JCPOA and Iran began to break out of the constraints of that agreement. We need to get back to the full set of tools of the IAEA and to add to it the cooperation of a future Iranian government in terms of understanding what's happened to the fissile material in the meantime, when the IAEA did not have eyes essentially on the nuclear enterprise.
Ernest, what is the worst case scenario and what's at stake here, given how there is a lot we still don't know, to your point, in terms of the possible proliferation of these nuclear assets and the role that non-state actors might actually play then?
Well, clearly, again, we don't know the future of the Iranian government, the regime. And by the way, I think it is as likely that we end up, frankly, with a military autocracy, the Revolutionary Guard, at least for some time. Now, the worst case scenario would appear to be that, first of all, materials, like I mentioned, the 60% uranium, have in fact been hidden away. There's, relatively speaking, chaos in the country, and trained scientists, nuclear scientists, with materials start dispersing to other places. And then we would have a terrible situation on our hands in terms of possible terrorist activity, not only from Iran, but from other places which have taken control of those materials and have the knowledge base from those scientists. But we don't know. As I say, we're very early on in this military operation. We're very early on in terms of understanding the succession plan for the Supreme Leader, what the role of the Revolutionary Guard will be. We do know that the opposition does not appear to be well organized. As the ambassador said, is certainly not armed as far as we know. They have no charismatic leader. And so, as I say, anything is possible, including a possible ascendancy of the Revolutionary Guard, which would be exactly the opposite of what was intended.
Ernest, how much do we know about the third enrichment plant, and how much does the, obviously clandestine nature of how Natanz and Fordow were built tells us that potentially there's intelligence that we don't have at the moment in terms of what the capabilities and infrastructure remains?
Right. Well, Haidi, you're certainly correct that we don't really know what the situation is with possible deeply buried assets, deeply buried enrichment plants. I think we just don't know. But what we do know is that if Iran chooses to continue down the nuclear path, they will almost certainly go to increasing depths, increasing security for their enrichment facilities. Certainly, they have now seen 2 military operations directly against them, and I think we would have to assume that they will go to much more deeply buried sites.
Your point about the Revolutionary Guard is such a fascinating one, right? Do we assume that they sort of retain that level of loyalty to whoever replaces the Supreme Leader, or is there potentially going to be some tension there given different vested interests in that group, which has, of course, over the past decades really risen to a position of significant power?
Yeah, I think the words vested interests are quite appropriate. We should not forget that the Revolutionary Guard has some not precisely known, but some very, very major engagement in the Iranian economy. Frankly, a lot of the sanctions have even raised their stature in terms of the economy. For example, clearly Iran has continued to export about 1.5 million barrels of oil per day, much of it to China. And if anything, the Revolutionary Guard, precisely because it must be against the sanctions, has largely taken control of that. So the Revolutionary Guard, I think, is they may have had, of course, some decapitation of their leadership, but I also think we don't understand in the West enough that Iran has built intentionally a pretty resilient system in terms of Plan B, Plan C, Plan D, and I'm sure there will be officers in the Revolutionary Guard who will want to maintain their strong advantage in terms of security and in terms of the economy and the financial resources that they have cornered, to be honest. And the real question is, will there be a cadre of Revolutionary Guard officers who take the opposite tack and who decide that they are willing to cooperate with the West to establish a country that is not, for example, spreading terror and security risk throughout the region. We don't know right now. I'd have to be honest and say that my bet would be that it will be very, very difficult to dislodge the Revolutionary Guard from a leadership role in the near term.
Ernest, as we speak, we are waiting for the U.S. president to also get off Air Force One. And as we watch these live pictures and perhaps any form of interaction from the president with the media, it's perhaps worth thinking about the justification for the strike on Iran in concert with Israel at this stage. I mean, coming into this weekend, what do we actually really know about the imminent nuclear threat that Iran actually posed?
Well, I don't believe there was any imminent threat. meaning very, very short-term threat in any dimension that I can tell. Now, the president laid out what has been an almost 50-year history of, I would say, legitimate complaints on our side. But to be honest, I don't see any indication that Iran had, in a serious way, taken up the nuclear program again. They were continuing to work on their missile capabilities, and there's no doubt, I think, that that they are probably, let's say, nearly at least a decade away from having a very major ICBM-like capability, but they were working on it. Clearly, their proxies throughout the region have been largely degraded. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis to a certain extent, Shia militias in Iraq, but they weren't eliminated. And if Iran does feel that they are existentially threatened, one could see them dialing up the pressure on their proxies as well to start creating more problems in the region. But I have certainly seen nothing that suggests that there was an imminent threat. So why the military action was taken exactly now is unclear. There are reports that, of course, the intelligence agencies had identified the meetings that were occurring with many high-level officials, including the supreme leader, as an opportunity. But then again, my understanding is that those were fairly regular meetings and did not have to trigger a military operation right now. So it seems to me it was more on the basis of long-standing issues, little progress, at least according to the administration, on the negotiations, on the nuclear negotiations. No progress, as far as I could tell, on terms of the missile front, and certainly with time, a slow rebuilding of their proxies and of their capabilities. So, answer is, I don't see anything that would trigger a response, trigger a military operation immediately, but there were lots of signs that in the long term, this was going to drift back to a situation of heightened threat. And I go back to what I started with. I still feel very uncertain about what the fate of that 60% enriched material was, because to me, that is a very, very big deal.
And we just don't know its whereabouts at this stage, to your point. Thank you so much. Ernest Moniz is co-chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and former U.S. Secretary of Energy. Great to have you on the program today. Let's take another look at how commodities are faring. Brent continues pairing some of the early pop. Gold still catching a bit. U.S. stock futures are down 1%. Let's get the outlook for commodities now. Joining us is Jorge Leon. He is Senior Vice President and Head of Geopolitical Analysis at Rystad Energy. Jorge, always good to see you. Let's start off with the reaction function in Brent, because we did see, a spike in the initial stages, maybe a bit of a pairing now. How appropriately priced were energy markets for the strike over the weekend and the death of the Ayatollah, the concerns that maybe Iran could take the nuclear option and formally close the Strait of Hormuz?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Well, I was a bit surprised, actually, about the price reaction. My initial guess was that we were going to see prices, Brent at least, above 85, closer to $90 per barrel. We've seen now that the price is around $79, $80 per barrel. That's close to a 10% increase. But one thing I think is important to remember, just a couple of months ago, before the tension with Iran started, prices were below $60 per barrel. So that really means that with all the Iranian tension, prices have increased 30% in just a couple of months. But I think that the market needs to keep a close eye on what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. I think that's the key to fully understand the scope of this crisis.
So when you talk about the scope, if they formally close the Strait of Hormuz, are we going to see Brent at 100 or maybe even beyond that?
Well, I guess it depends on the duration of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, all traffic is halted. Now, around 15 million barrels per day of crude passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. There are some options to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline, who can export 4 million barrels per day. The UAE also has the Abu Dhabi pipeline that can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. But in reality, it would be impossible to offset the full 15 million barrels per day. Now, let's also not forget the global market dynamics. We're in a year of global oil oversupply. So that also limits a little bit the upside price pressure. But if we are looking into a scenario where there continues and longer disruption to the Strait of Hormuz for more than a few days towards weeks or months, then we're definitely seeing a scenario possible of $100 per barrel.
Can OPEC Plus also cushion a lot of that as well, with flexibility on how much they release onto the market? We're hearing that they'll probably do more.
Haidi, I think that's a great question. I don't think that there are many levers that OPEC Plus can pull. Let's not forget that OPEC Plus can decide to increase production more than anticipated. Before the events over the weekend, OPEC Plus partially decided to increase production by 137 KBD. At the end, they increased a bit more, 206,000 barrels per day. But in reality, the problem is that most of those additional barrels need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So in reality, the impact of additional OPEC Plus in production hikes might be actually very, very limited.
I wanted to take a look at a chart showing tanker rates that have been moving steadily higher as well. How much buffer do you see in this pricing? Again, I understand it's unknown territory. It depends on the duration of these disruptions. But is there less buffer when it comes to tanker rates?
I think there's less buffer for sure. And again, it all goes back on what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. And I really want to differentiate between two scenarios. One scenario is the actual closure of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran, the military actions in the Strait of Hormuz. And the other very important scenario is where ship owners just completely, for precautionary reasons, stop passing through the Strait of Hormuz. In reality, the impact of both the scenarios in the oil market is actually the same. And let's not forget another important element here, that even if situations de-escalate sometime in the next few days, reopening the Strait of Hormuz will take a few days, if not weeks. So I don't think we're looking into a scenario that could be easily resolved, let's say, in the next week or two, in the best case scenario.
Jorge, what do we know about Iran's exports then, if there's so much uncertainty and instability in the region? Can it really be business as usual? And then for the likes of China, for example, does that mean also turning more to the likes of Russia for energy?
That's a great question. Let's not forget that almost all of the Iranian exports flow to China, 1.5 million barrels per day. And at the moment, those flows have stopped because of the lack of transit in the Strait of Hormuz. So for China, probably the best option that they have is to try to tap more into the Russian flows, given particularly now that the Russian exports to India are coming down. And also important to remember that China has been very wisely stockpiling a lot of crude last year, so they have a big buffer to overcome the current crisis.
As we've been speaking, we've been seeing the U.S. president descending the stairs of Air Force One and walking there on the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews. Jorge, I wonder, what does the role of the U.S. supply perhaps play against the backdrop of this spike in oil prices? Are we likely to see it tapping into its SPRs, especially in a year where higher palm prices might actually turn into an election issue in the midterms?
I think this is one of the few levers that the market has, particularly in the U.S. and in the OECD. Right now, the U.S. has 415 million barrels of SPRs, much lower than what we had before the Russia-Ukraine war, which were around 700 million barrels. So the scope is less. But if this is an extended crisis, and if we see prices spiking for a sustained period of time, then really the only lever that the U.S. and the West world has is to tap into the SPRs. That would be an emergency situation, but clearly this looks like a textbook example of an energy crisis. So it will be, in my opinion, very well justified.
Jorge, really great to have you with us. Jorge Leon, who's a Senior Vice President and Head of Geopolitical Analysis at Rystad Energy. Take a look at the movers, and there's no surprises that we're seeing some pricing moves when it comes to Australian energy shares. Some of the first companies really to react to the disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz, as well as broader oil prices under pressure as well. Perhaps not as much as we were expecting, but we are seeing upside when it comes to Santos and Woodside Energy. We know that LNG is going to see some big disruptions too, again, depending on how long this conflict goes on for. We're seeing Crude Energy up by 15% there, and Beach Energy also up by close to 9%. The other sectors that we're watching, airlines, aviation, obviously a key one that's really getting that double whammy, not just because we're seeing these airspace disruptions causing huge amounts of flight cancellations and rerouting, flights being grounded as well and being sent back. We're also seeing the impact of potential higher oil prices. Qantas there dropping by 1.9%. We're off those session lows at the moment. That was the lowest in about 10 months. We're seeing huge surges when it comes to trading volumes as well. But the prospect of $100 for jet fuel, some of that further pressure from airspace, pressures, $80 oil, really threatening some of these Asian airlines that are unhedged when it comes to oil prices there. Drones, also one to watch in the sector. We're seeing upside of as much as 12% at one point for Drone Shield trading here in Sydney. You can take a look at the live streaming news and interviews as this breaking story continues. Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis and more are all in one place. You can check it out at bloomberg.com/videos. This is Bloomberg. Take a look at what we're watching when it comes to markets at the moment, coming online and really getting that first reaction to the US-led attacks on Iran. We continue to watch that in terms of further retaliation, further strikes from Israel. And really the key question is to the duration of this conflict. That's going to have major implications for how much we see that haven bid still continuing to play out, how much we see that surge in oil and energy assets and energy shares, as well as some of those tanker prices, for example, also spiking with these disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz, and how elongated that disruption really is going to be. When it comes to Japanese stocks, where they're being kind of seen lower at this point, really equity investors looking like across the region we're going to see some defensive plays, despite, of course, when it comes to Japan, a weak again is at play there. We're looking for Japan as well, that exposure to any disruption to LNG prices and supply. We've already seen that play out for some of the Australian players like Santos and Woodside this morning. That could also be a short-term drag on the economy, not to mention, of course, potentially the implications for inflation globally. We'll also be watching some of those tech and AI-specific names as well, Avril, with, of course, some of the drone names, defense names keenly in focus today.
Yeah, as we watch the market reaction, we're also watching out for China's reaction. It's criticized the U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran, warning they risk plunging the Middle East into deeper instability and undermining international law. Let's bring in our China correspondent, Mimin Lo in Beijing. So, Mimin, walk us through China's response.
Yeah, China's response has been swift but measured. We have the Chinese Foreign Ministry putting out a statement soon after the conflict, saying that this attack on Iran is an attack on its sovereignty, and calling for a ceasefire, calling for a return to dialogue. And these are very predictable lines that we hear time and again, even during the 12-day war last year as well. But interestingly, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a phone call with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, yesterday. These two members of the UN National Security Council having an emergency phone call. And you can see on the screen that he said that it is unacceptable for the US and Israel to attack Iran to try to incite regime change, and that the conflict could spill over into the greater region and push the Middle East into a dangerous abyss. And I think it's interesting to pay attention to what Wang Yi said, particularly about inciting regime change, because many analysts have been saying that the top priority for China is to ensure stability. So it will be watching very closely for any emergence of a new power in Iran to ensure that that new regime will not be closely aligned with the United States. And it's also interesting that this conflict is already pushing China and Russia closer together. The two foreign ministers speaking, both of them aligned in this view that Iran has been an important counterbalance to the US.
President Xi and Trump are supposed to meet at the summit potentially end of the month or early April. This further complicates the agenda, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course. And this has really been at the crux of the matter, right? It's just a couple of weeks from now, President Trump is expected to travel to Beijing to meet with President Xi. We haven't heard from either countries whether or not this summit is going to be postponed or cancelled given the latest developments. But still, analysts are saying that we now have to pare back our expectations as to what could realistically be achieved in that summit. But also bear in mind, yes, China and Iran have a close relationship, but China is far more important to Iran than Iran is to China. Yes, China buys a lot of Iranian oil, but all in, it only constitutes about 13% or so of China's total oil imports by sea. And some analysts are saying that Iran simply is not a big enough or important enough interest for China to sacrifice its relations with the United States, because I think China still wants to ensure that trade truce remains in place to protect its economic interests, given we are now in a week when China's top leaders and the National Parliament will be meeting to discuss the next 5-year plan for the country. And so they will want to ensure that tariffs remain low. And yes, the US Supreme Court has struck down those tariffs, but remember, the Trump administration has been still looking for alternative ways to raise tariffs on China, whether it's Section 301 or Section 232. So that is still going to be the main priority for the Chinese government.
Bloomberg's Min Lo there in Beijing. Well, in terms of regional reactions, of course, we've seen some measured words from Canberra over the weekend. Japan's government has so far refrained from voicing full support for the US-led attacks on Iran. Kyoto reporting that Prime Minister Takaichi has asked for analysis on the potential economic and logistical impacts. Let's take a look at the outlook when it comes to what we're expecting. Jesper, Koll, who's an expert director at Monex Group, joins us now. So Jesper, first of all, let me get sort of your broader reaction to what we've seen. Of course, almost everyone that we've spoken to says it really does depend on how long this continues for, right? How long this war or conflict is extended. How do you view, I guess, the economic and the geopolitical risks here?
Look, I mean, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty because you're basically poking a hornet's nest with the attacks on all the surrounding countries. And we just simply don't know, what the duration, is going to be, plus the complication of the regime change. And of course, more pertinent, and this is not just for Japan, but for everybody, if you do get a genuine oil shock, which is to say over the next not just couple of days, but really over the next couple of months, oil trading around $100, $120, that would of course have significant implications, in terms of not just inflation, but really here in Japan, putting the agenda of Prime Minister Takaichi at risk because she has promised the Japanese people that she would bring energy and food inflation down. So the war in Iran immediately, if there is long duration, causes a big problem.
Yes, but what do you see as being the inflation issue, which of course is front and center for the Bank of Japan?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's very simple. If you do the maths, if oil trades, around $100, $110 for the next couple of months, you're adding back almost 0.5% to Japanese consumer price inflation. And that's obviously a supply shock, which is to say that the Bank of Japan hiking interest rates is actually the wrong policy measure. You would actually want to get some income support, another fiscal package, with also Prime Prime Minister Takaichi doesn't really want to do. So we shall see. Lots of uncertainty here. But, the good news is that in terms of the domestic animal spirits, restarting the domestic nuclear energy supply, the civilian use of nuclear power, building up more resilient supply chains, that sort of business investment here in Japan is already very strong. And I think that the crisis in the Middle East, is going to make that even stronger in Japan, for Japan. That's where Japanese companies are going to be investing.
Yeah, not to mention at a time where Japan's defense spending has been on the up. Jesper, we're hearing about how the UAE Foreign Ministry is summoning the Iranian ambassador over these attacks. I mean, the worry of the regional conflict being more widespread and more protracted, to your point earlier. But I wonder, given the uncertainties, the instability, what are you seeing in terms of Japanese assets and the allure from investors as traditional havens? We know how that relationship for the yen, that's been tested. For JGBs, that seems to be trickling back in. What are you seeing?
Look, I think that, you will see, number one, the outlook for the dollar remains a very constructive one. And obviously, if oil prices go higher, that generates additional incremental demand for the dollar. I think that Japanese domestic investors, continuing to actually recycle the big current account surplus, buying global assets, particularly U.S. assets, that's going to be going forward. It was interesting. There was a beginning of some new capital flows from Japan into the People's Republic of China over the last couple of months. Obviously, China is also at risk from higher energy prices. So it'll be interesting to see whether a preference for America versus China is going to reassert itself.
Jesper, always great to chat with you. Jesper Koll is an expert director at Monex Group. Well, this conflict in Iran has thrown global air travel into chaos, with airspace closed over the region and major hubs in Dubai, Doha, Abu Dhabi suspending operations. Bloomberg's Paul Allen joins us now with more. So it's really this double whammy, oil prices as well as a disruption to flights that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's right. The whole situation is in flux, and already we've seen significant disruption. I mean, there were strikes over the weekend at airports at Abu Dhabi. One person killed by shrapnel there. The details are a little bit hazy. Dubai Airport, I mean, this is an area you'd normally think was safe. It was hit by a missile over the weekend, injuring 4 people. So this is the world's busiest international airport. We've had 1,200 flights cancelled now. The UAE Civil Aviation Authority saying 20,000 passengers have been impacted. Now, that seems a little conservative in many requests. That airport sometimes handles up to 10,000 passengers per hour, 95 million passengers in the past year. So the upheaval is going to be huge. And, of course, it ripples out because there's this complex global choreography around flights. If planes and crews are not in the right place at the right time, there's a tremendous knock-on effect. So we're seeing delays in places like India, Canada, Europe. Here in Australia, the government's warned to expect travel disruption over the coming days. And already we're seeing this reflected in the Qantas share price, which I know you've mentioned earlier, off at 9% at one point. Trading volume really heavy. I think it's now off about 6%. But other stocks as well. The flight centre's been impacted. We heard from Qantas in a statement saying there has been currently no impact, but it's got a code share agreement with Emirates. The share price is down. Seems a little optimistic.
Every time you talk to an airline CEO, I think your second question is probably on hedging oil prices, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Bloomberg Intelligence has been running some analysis on this as well. And if you work on the assumption that jet fuel prices hit $100 a barrel or north of that, well, it's the hedged carriers that come out of this okay. And those include Qantas, Singapore Airlines, Japan Airlines, ANA, Cathay. They're better positioned to weather this impact. The big 3 airlines in China, none of them are hedged. Indigo in India also not hedged, and the rupee is very, very weak. So Indigo is going to be an interesting stock to watch when we get to the open in India as well, particularly if this drags on and fuel prices go beyond that potential $100 a barrel level.
Bloomberg's Paul Allen there. One to watch, Avril, as we head into the open in India today.
And as we speak, we're hearing how the IDF is starting an additional wave of strikes in Tehran, continuing those strikes on those targets in the country. No letting up when it comes to military action in Iran. We're looking at Nikkei futures, Topix futures pointing to steep declines at the open, but in terms of sectors that could see a bit of trading the other direction, energy shippers as well. The yen is losing ground, perhaps those concerns about higher oil prices. JGB futures, that's interesting in how it's been catching a bit. Is its safe haven allure returning, especially following on from the ructions we saw earlier in the year that have more or less been allayed? We'll check the markets open in Tokyo next. This is Bloomberg.
This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. Well, Korea gets a bit of respite, Avril, as we head into what is undoubtedly going to be a frenetic trading week. So much of this will come back to how much pressure we see on the upside when it comes to energy prices, crude prices. Clearly, we've seen that reaction, the haven bid when it comes to gold, Treasury, sovereign bonds playing out. But the question is the duration of this conflict with Israel and the US and Iran, and how long it goes on for will really inform how extended the pricing action is going to be. If you take a look at JGBs, for example, we're expecting that curve set to steepen. We're also expecting, when it comes to the side of equities trading, just a broadly defensive posture by investors, and that will start off when it comes to trading in Tokyo as well, despite the fact that we are also contending with the benefit of a weaker yen, but that's not going to be the major story dominating the rhetoric today. It will all be down to this geopolitical risk, the ongoing conflict there. We're seeing the Nikkei 225 really opening down by 1.5%. The Topix also off by 1.5%. It'll be interesting to look at, yes, we'll see downside when it comes to the airlines in particular. We'll see some moves when it comes to energy names, particularly LNG names that are exposed in the Tokyo session, but also looking at the defense sector, AI, as well as the tech heavy, the drone makers, for example, already seeing upside in the Sydney session an hour into trading on the ASX. Dollar yen trading at that 156 level, and we are watching, as I said, that month-long trend of the Japanese yield curve flattening set to go into reverse with the surge in energy prices and the weakness in the currency, Avril.
Yeah, when it comes to reaction, what we've been watching out for is how treasuries react. This is the first time they're trading since the war in Iran began over the weekend. So treasuries, in terms of cash treasuries, you're seeing that move even lower past the 4% handle, of course, which is something they already breached on Friday. There were some private credit concerns, as well as Nvidia wobbles, and that risk off, I suppose, is what translated into the bid for treasuries. And then with this haven demand, you're seeing yields dipping even further in terms of treasuries. Also watching how this potentially plays out on the dollar, but we are seeing a bid for the greenback this morning, along with some of the other havens, including gold. Brent continues to pair some of those earlier gains. Taking a look at the Treasury yields on the 10-year, as I mentioned earlier, this has actually declined to the lowest level since April 2025. And of course, this was against the backdrop at the time of the Liberation Day ructions. Now, President Trump says the U.S. military will continue bombing Iran until his objectives are achieved, while warning there may be further American casualties. In a social media post, he also had a message for Iranians.
Call upon all Iranian patriots who yearn for freedom to seize this moment, to be brave, be bold, be heroic, and take back your country. America is with you. I made a promise to you, and I fulfilled that promise. The rest will be up to you, but we'll be there to help.
Let's bring in Bloomberg Balance of Power co-anchor Kaylee Lines and our Deputy UAE Bureau Chief Abir Abu Omar. Abir, let's start with you first, because we are seeing these fresh attacks on Iran. What do we know about the extent in which both the U.S. and Israel are planning to keep things up?
Yeah, hi. So the attacks have been going on for the past 48 hours, and there's really no sign of them subsiding. The latest we know is that the U.S. has had over 1,000 targets in Iran at this point. Israel continuing the attack as well. President Trump saying that the attacks are not going to stop until all the objectives have been achieved. Now, the one key thing here is we're not entirely clear on what the objectives of the Trump administration are at this point. So Khamenei has been killed. That was confirmed early hours of the morning, this morning, or should I say yesterday morning. But we're not entirely sure what the objectives are, and the risks that lie ahead are quite severe. So when we talk about oil prices, for example, those have jumped in the early hours of trading. They're close to $80 a barrel. That is not good for President Trump, but it's also not entirely good for the region as well. Now, OPEC Plus has hiked production to over 200 barrels a day earlier when they met on Sunday. The Strait of Hormuz is also under pressure. We know that the Iranians have said that there is no intention to close down the Strait of Hormuz, but ships have moved away from the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Bloomberg Economics estimates that if a closure were to happen, and still that is not the base case scenario even now, but if that were to happen, oil prices would jump to about $108 a barrel. That is not good neither for the importers nor the exporters, because as a matter of fact, oil above 100 still doesn't balance budgets for a lot of countries in the region. So we're watching for these escalations and what they mean for especially Arab Gulf states who have been hit pretty hard. Even Oman, that is a key mediator between Iran and the U.S., was not kept safe. A port in Oman, the Duqm port, was hit earlier by Iran. And when the foreign minister of Iran, Abbas Araghchi, was speaking about the attack against Oman, he said that he called his counterpart and assured him that the Iranians, that was not their main choice, that the armed forces in Iran had acted in somewhat of an isolation. So you're seeing some domestic risks coming up in Iran as well that is now being ruled by a governing body post the killing of Ayatollah Khamenei.
Risks for President Trump too, right, Kaylee, when it comes to war fatalities on the U.S. side, when it comes to the potential risk of energy prices and inflation and just the domestic unpopularity of another conflict. Have we heard from the president today?
Well, he did release that second video statement on his True Social platform, but he has not spoken directly with any members of the press since these operations were launched in the early hours of Saturday here in the U.S. In fact, he just arrived back to the White House, and instead of answering questions around Iran, he simply made a comment to reporters about statues in the White House Rose Garden and then proceeded to go inside. So we are still looking for answers to the president, from the president, on some of the very same questions Baer was just speaking to. This idea that we do not know fully what the objectives of the United States are here. In his State of the Union address last Tuesday, the president did make it clear Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. So is this just about making sure that they have no nuclear capability when the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and others have increasingly been talking about their ballistic missile capacity, something we know Israel very much was in the president's ear about as well. And of course, the idea of regime change. President Trump is encouraging the Iranian people to stand up here. So it's unclear how long it will take to achieve these very obscure objectives. The president has said in an interview with the Daily Mail today that he thinks it could be about 4 weeks, though he also suggested in another conversation with a reporter from The Atlantic that the interim leaders of Iran are interested in talking, and he will talk to them. So maybe there is a path forward for diplomacy, but what the president has made clear in his video messages is that these operations will continue from a combat operations standpoint. And of course, Congress is going to perhaps play a factor in here. We know that top administration officials will be briefing lawmakers over the course of Monday and Tuesday here in Washington on the proceedings in the Middle East. And there will be war powers votes that will be tried to be forced in both the House and the Senate. Unclear, though, what the future of those will be, knowing President Trump at the end of the day could just decide to veto them and carry on as he wishes.
Yeah, this was undertaken without congressional approval, which was the case for Venezuela as well. Kaylee, I wonder what can provide the checks and balances at this stage in terms of further military action. Might it be in the form of what we're seeing in oil prices, the concerns there about higher prices in the pump, might the economic factor actually provide that check and balance?
Well, it's an excellent question because we know while the president is not up for re-election himself, there are major political considerations here for his party as we head to the midterm elections in November. It's going to be very difficult, as it is, for House Republicans to hold on to the majority in that chamber. And potentially, if you were to see a spike in gasoline prices, which the president has touted as one of his accomplishments, bringing those gas prices down, that could make the political calculation much more difficult if you're trying to defend your economic record. So certainly that is going to be something that we'll pay close attention to. We've seen Morning Consult, a pollster here in the U.S., put out data over the course of the weekend, a snap poll in reaction to the Iran attacks. And it shows that while the public is largely split in terms of how supportive of they are or whether or not they thought this action needed to be taken, when you ask them about the potential economic impacts, the majority are concerned about higher oil prices. And only 18% of the public, when they are presented with that potential economic consequence, are supportive of this action. So certainly public sentiment doesn't seem to be with the president and this administration in that regard.
Baer, when it comes to what's going on within the leadership in Iran, how they're coping with these senior level losses, is it sort of just survival mode? What do we know about the succession plan, if there is one? What happens to the Revolutionary Guard? And I guess the steps forward in terms of that power vacuum?
Right, so there is no successor as of now. There are potential candidates, including Khamenei's own son and some other leaders, some ex-presidents as well there. But as of now, the ruling body in Iran is made up of the president, the head of judiciary, and a jurist from the Guardian Council. So this is usually what happens when the supreme leader dies, and this is the body that is that is ruling the country as of now. And that is probably the body that President Trump was alluding to the talks to him speaking with. Essentially, this is what we know about who is in charge of matters as of now. But there's a lot of it's torn in the country right now. I mean, the death of Khamenei has brought some tensions within Iran itself. Domestically, the situation is between those who are supporting and those who are who came out in masses. Essentially in jubilation, celebrating the death of Khamenei, who had a solid grip on the country, but others came out and mourned his passing. But the successor for Khamenei, that matter could take hours, it could take days, it could take a couple of weeks. We don't know yet, but naturally what Iran would want, or what the governing body would want at this point, is to promptly come up with a successor to replace Ayatollah Khamenei. So that is what we know as of now. We keep on reporting on when the new supreme leader comes to power.
To your point about these mixed reaction, he was, after all, a man who ruled Iran for almost 40 years, and we're seeing perhaps this divided country as we look to the future of Iran. Bloomberg Balance of Power co-anchor Kaylee Lines and our Deputy UAE Bureau Chief Abir Abu Omar. Thank you to you both. Now, we've also been tracking the market reaction. For now, you're seeing Japanese stocks on an index basis. That's trending lower. You're seeing the yen coming under pressure. JGB seem to be catching a bid. Treasuries, too, also on the 10-year yield that continues slipping. For more on what we should be watching, let's bring in Mark Matthews, Head of Asia Research at Julius Baer. Mark, great to have you in the studio on a day like that. What do you make of the developments over the weekend, and perhaps more importantly, what we're going to see for the next couple of weeks in terms of risk versus treasuries and demand for havens as well?
There's not a lot that trades on the weekend, but there is a crypto gold price, and it was only up about 2% yesterday. Now it's up about 5%. And of course, to your point, we're starting to see things trade. I wouldn't say that the action suggests a panic by any means. I think the oil price is about $80 right now. Of course, it depends on how things go, but I'd say the initial reaction is fairly sanguine given what's happened. And then going forward, what I would say, Avril, is if you look back in history to around the end of World War II, there's been about 40 major geopolitical shocks. And where the S&P was 12 months later really depended on whether they had an economic impact or not. So I'll give you two examples. John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. 12 months later, the S&P was up about 25%. There was no economic impact. The Yom Kippur War obviously was followed in 1973 by the OPEC embargo, oil embargo, and that caused a recession. 12 months later, the S&P was down over 30%. So where this goes longer term really depends on the economic impact. Our sense is that it will be limited. If you recall Ukraine 2022, we were all very worried. Oil went over 100. It ended up not being a big deal. I think this will be similar.
So perhaps whatever we're seeing in market reaction today are the risks and the concerns. Your sense is perhaps we are overestimating that a little bit? Is that fair to say?
I think right now the market is trading the way it should be. But of course, we really don't know. I mean, Baer just said there's no command and control in Iran. And so there were missiles sent to a port in Oman, and the Straits of Hormuz handle about 20% of the oil in the world. So it could get bad. But I think just remembering how President Trump said he wants to avoid long wars in remote places. Right. We're 8 months to the midterms. Iran is politically isolated. I suspect that it won't be the worst case scenario.
The concerns then that higher oil prices might mean, inflationary read-through and then the chance that the Fed cuts less. Is that something that you think is realistic to expect?
It is if the Straits of Hormuz get shut down, which they never really have before. But it would be because the spare capacity in oil-producing countries and their ability to ramp up quickly is only about 5 or 6 million barrels per day, whereas the Straits of Hormuz handles about 20 million barrels per day.
But, Mark, you talk about this being largely about oil, right, for Trump. If we get into a situation where there is a replacement of the regime with one that's a little bit more friendly to the US and to the West, does that reshape American power over global oil flows?
Haidi, absolutely. And I think this is what it's all about, actually, because if in the future Iran is an American ally, the Americans will be directly and indirectly kind of influencing about a half of all the world's oil production. And as you know, most of Iran's oil that it exports is going to China. So there are huge geopolitical implications to this. And I agree completely with what you say. I think that many countries are probably struggling right now to know how to respond, like Saudi, Turkey, Egypt, but of course also Russia and China.
There are so many flow-on effects too, right? And a lot of it depends on what happens with this conflict from now. Are there going to be American boots on the ground? You say that we're very close. Well, we're the closest that we've been, right, for a long time when it comes to regime change. Is that a risk that you're looking at as being likely at this point? Because it would, from the outset, look like it needs a lot of more US input to get to that point.
Yeah, it's hard to know because, I mean, the estimates are that some 30,000 people were just killed in those protests in Iran. So you'd have to be a very brave person to go out on the streets right now. And I think that the people who would go out on the streets are actually being told to stay inside by the Americans because the attacks are continuing. So we'll see in a week or two if people do that. But ultimately, I think it would be in the armed forces if you see those kind of falling apart and we know the Americans and the Israelis are reaching out to many people in them through Telegram and various other means, offering money and amnesty. Anyway, if the armed forces and even the Revolutionary Guard, individuals there start to basically leave, then I think the whole thing could fall apart very quickly.
Mark, we have to leave it there for today, but really appreciate you coming in to talk us through the market reaction for now and where things stand maybe a couple of weeks or months from this point. Mark Matthews, Head of Asia Research at Julius Baer. Let's take a look at the movers in Japan as well. The usual suspects after the travel-related stocks took a bit of a hit. It does make you wonder as well the overplay or the read-through when it comes to energy prices on some of these Asia carriers. The oil-related stocks impacts, there you go, the pop of almost 8-9%, while the shippers are also seeing slight gains. Haidi.
Our next guest says he sees no obvious off-ramp for the military escalations in the Middle East. Joining us from Washington is Jonathan Panikoff, who's a director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. He also previously served as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East at the US National Intelligence Council. Jonathan, really great to have you with us. And I read your piece over the weekend, of course, with the context of the latest developments. Did it surprise you that this action was taken? Because in some ways, obviously, we have seen some internal regime weakness with the protests at the start of the year, with the US action in the middle of last year as well. But still, diplomatic talks were still ongoing and were supposed to carry through to this week.
Great to be with you. Look, it wasn't such a surprise. I think we always knew that this was one of the options that could happen. It's worth remembering that in June of last year, when the U.S. made the decision to also come in after Israel had requested to have a very narrow strike against the nuclear facilities, that also happened in between negotiating rounds, between the fifth and sixth round of negotiations. Once again, the Omanis were helping to broker them, as in this case, and President Trump made the decision to go forward. I think what's been surprising is not so much that this went forward, but that unlike then, it's not quite clear still what the goal is. And therefore, it's not quite clear what the strategy is. We've heard mixed things from the president. We heard just today that he'd be willing to talk to the interim leadership, even though the strikes are going to continue for, he said, maybe a month. There's still a lot of confusion about what comes next. And that's partly, I think, intentional by the president, but it's partly also because there's not a clear strategy by the U.S. before it launched this operation.
Jonathan, at the moment we're seeing on the CME circuit breaker being triggered at the NYMEX crude oil open. We saw that jump when it comes to the start of trading in Brent. But across the board, there's perhaps you could say a surprisingly sanguine reaction, right? A lot of this depends on what comes next for this conflict. Do we know what comes next? Does the US administration know what its true objectives are? And how much of a risk is there that involves further engagement and US boots on the ground?
I think it's unlikely that you're going to see U.S. boots on the ground. I think that's probably a red line for President Trump. At the same time, what the president seems to indicate is, look, what he wants is regime change, at least a more pliable regime at the end of this. In order to get there and not just have the default be that the Revolutionary Guards ultimately take power and control even more so than they've had, then it probably means to have some sort of alternative, real alternative government. You need somebody to actually switch sides, or you need somebody with, frankly, weapons to stand aside. We've seen this before in Iran. In 1979, before Khamenei came in, that's actually what happened. You saw the military kind of completely fade away, stand aside, and he came to power, Khomeini did. Now, I don't know that we're as likely to get there. And I think there are certain economic pressures, including from the oil markets, that may eventually make President Trump reconsider. It's worth noting from 2003 to 2011, during that period in the Iraq War, oil was about $72 a barrel. That's about $100 a barrel north of it in today's prices. We're not there yet, but if things continue apace, there's reason to believe that we could get there, and that could obviously have political implications for Trump and change the way he thinks of this, and I bet Iran is counting on that.
Trump seems to be counting on an Iranian uprising. Is that realistic to expect in a country where there's no organized opposition? We're hearing about internet blackouts. What is the calculus then going to be on the ground among Iranians, and how might that actually influence whether we see regime change?
Yeah, and it's much harder than it would have been if we had this conversation, say, 2 or 3 months ago, if the strikes had come then. The reality is it's hard to imagine that the January, frankly, slaughtering of so many Iranians who came out to protest at the beginning of last month isn't going to have a chilling effect going forward. Nevertheless, you're right. The president is clearly counting on that happening. And I think what he's hoping is, look, if you can have significant regime decapitation strikes where more and more leadership is killed, where you're going 2 to 3 rungs down, when you start to get into the senior, but not really senior, rank and file of the army, of the Revolutionary Guards, those people themselves might decide, look, we also are not nearly as ideological as the leadership of the regime was. We also have brothers and sisters and parents and children who are going to struggle in this economy, what's left of it. Food prices have soared, inflation is out of control. And I think what President Trump is hoping is that will prompt, frankly, the regime to slightly melt away, and so the protesters can come onto the streets, organize in a cohesive way. That's a lot of ifs to get there, and that's a lot of leaps to get there. But my best guess is that's what President Trump is hoping for.
Jonathan, do we assume that the loyalties of the Revolutionary Guard, of course, whose powers and vested interests have really built up over the decades, does that just transfer to whoever the new leader is, or is there a real concern that there might be an even harder line positioning being taken in that power vacuum?
I think it's probably likely there's going to be a harder line positioning taken. Look, the Guards now are not just protecting the ideals of the revolution as they were originally developed to do. They are in every sector of the Iranian economy. And actually, some of their leadership are among the most wealthy Iranians because of how the black market has operated in that country. The reality is that at this point, I think most senior Guard leaders who might play an influential role will expect the next supreme leader to be even more deferential to them than the previous one was. Ayatollah Khamenei came in at a time when the Guards really did not have meaningful power comparatively. That's not true today. And so I expect that deference to be expected. And if there is a new leader chosen, especially soon, it almost certainly won't be within the formal framework, or if it is, it'll also be with the Guard senior leadership signing off on that person as well.
If the U.S. is to engage with whatever future leadership then, what is your expectation of who they will actually then be negotiating with?
I think that's $1 million question. Look, obviously, there's a couple of people who can be negotiated with. One is the President Pezeshkian, who is still there, who from all accounts doesn't actually have significant influence. Another one is Ali Larijani, the head of the Supreme National Security Council. In rough terms, he's the equivalent of the National Security Advisor here in the United States, but he's far more powerful than that. Longtime advisor to Ayatollah Khamenei. I think those are the two people, though, that you would at least have to start with. Whether that's going to be sufficient to be able to have them get a deal is less clear.
Jonathan, so good to chat. Thank you so much for your analysis. Jonathan Panikoff is director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. This is Bloomberg.
We are seeing haven plays still very much in action here, as we've seen particularly the US dollar surge that we've seen in early Asia trading. Perhaps a little bit muted than expected, though, as we see really looking for further signs of how long this conflict is going to be. We're seeing risk-off currencies like the Aussie underwater. We are just watching that global reaction to the ongoing developments with the US and Israel's strikes on Iran and the retaliation as well. In Japan, we're hearing from Prime Minister Takaichi that they're cooperating with other countries on the Iran situation. They are gathering information when it comes to the Iran situation. So really quite a restrained tone as we hear from Prime Minister Takaichi speaking there in Parliament, making really reference to the position of Japan when it comes to Iran's nuclear weapons arsenal, saying that position that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons remains unchanged, but they are cooperating with other countries when it comes to that situation. We have heard from other countries across the region. Australia was actually one of the first to react over the weekend, really pretty measured remarks as to what happens with this regime and the level of support for US and Israel as this operation continues. We are seeing when it comes to Japanese assets, unsurprisingly, the downside trading in the Nikkei 225 as well as the topics. We're seeing really Japanese assets being hit from multiple fronts, from airlines with the airspace disruptions, the oil price situation, energy stocks, as well as some of those moves in defense, as well as tech names as well, Avril.
Haidi, this is really coming against the backdrop of a massive power shift, a seismic one in Iran. You think about how it is a man who has been ruling the country for almost 40 years, really being taken out by the U.S. What does this mean for the vacuum of power or the potential future leadership in the country at a time where, even without a formal closure of the Strait of Hormuz, we are seeing ships, tanks, they seem to be avoiding the strait. It cannot be overstated the extent in which this could have market implications. But for the moment, some have called this reaction a bit subdued, I suppose. Oil surged by the most in 4 years at one point, but you are seeing it pairing some of those earlier gains. And you're seeing how this U.S.-Israel war against Iran has plunged the global crude market into turmoil. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Stephen Sturczynski, who leads our Asia energy coverage. Stephen, great to have you. It cannot be overstated the shift that we've been seeing in terms of the leadership in Iran and what might come from here on out. But what are you seeing in terms of the possible scenarios and how high oil might go?
I mean, I think all the scenarios that we look at really revolve around the Strait of Hormuz. I think one interesting thing as well to look at is infrastructure. So those are the two pieces. So one is, how long is the Strait of Hormuz going to be shut? And depending on how long it's shut, that will affect the global market. It'll make it tighter. The market has been frothier. There's been a lot of output from the U.S. We are facing a glut year. But a lot of oil, about a fifth of it, seafaring oil, goes through the Strait of Hormuz. So if it's shut for an extended period of time, more than a few days, then you are suddenly having to look at Chinese refiners having to find alternative supplies or things like that. But that, again, could just be a short-term issue. Something that could be longer-term is, are there key infrastructure that are hit? Pipelines, offshore oil fields, onshore oil fields, refineries, any infrastructure that's hit that requires more than a few days of outage, that would also likely lead to higher prices. That's more of a worst case scenario. I mean, according to ship tracking data and satellite imagery, Iran has still been actually shipping oil out of the country despite all of this happening. So there is still oil hitting the market. There is still some level of flows. A lot of focus is on Hormuz. But I think going forward is, how long does this entire conflict last? And what is the impact on infrastructure?
The impact on infrastructure, not just on the Iranian side, right? Because these Gulf-producing countries over the weekend and now still could be getting hit.
Absolutely.
What is that going to mean for supply risks at a time where OPEC Plus is upping outputs?
I mean, in recent history, there has been times when Saudi facilities have been hit by drones and things like that. So, and what you're seeing over the weekend, these stark images of what's happening in Dubai and other places, while those are city centers, they could also, and U.S. military bases, of course, if Iran were to shift its focus on oil infrastructure of its neighbors, that is also a key risk that likely isn't quite fully priced into the market at the moment. But that all being said, there are a lot of unknowns, and it really does depend on how long does this conflict last. Trump says it could be 4 weeks or longer. If that's the case, what is the damage to the region? That's what the market's trying to understand, and we're just in uncharted territory, so it's really hard to say.
So much of this is uncharted territory, right? And I wonder if you've sort of had a look at what would happen if the US ends up with an Iranian regime that is perhaps, at least on the surface, a little bit more Western friendly. If the US would have greater control over oil flows as a result of that, does that change the landscape in terms of how much control America then has over global energy flows?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting proposition, and there are a lot of ifs, right, in that statement and in that question. But I think certainly if there was a regime that was friendlier to the United States, at least we could begin looking at removing sanctions on Iranian oil, right? All Iranian oil has essentially been exported on shadow fleet vessels. And when you look at Venezuela, for example, you know, the U.S. changed the regime. It's a regime that's closer to the U.S., and Trump was very happy to say, hey, we got all these barrels, and the oil is going to be, more of it's going to be flowing, and there will be investment. Clearly, that's something that Trump probably wants, right? If you look at what Trump likes, there are a few things that he likes beyond McDonald's. There's also, low gasoline prices. He loves that. So more Iranian oil on the market would result in lower prices. So that is likely. I know I'm not a mind reader for the White House, but I think it's been pretty well telegraphed that he does like it when there's more oil flowing. So I think that is one expectation you would see. Whether the U.S. controls it or not, that's a big question. And what does control even mean for an oil market that's it goes to the shipments go to the highest bidders. There are long-term contracts, things like that. I don't think the U.S. would be able to divert shipments quite as they have with what potentially has been happening in Venezuela. But still, more oil on the market would probably be something that the White House would favor.
Stephen Stepchinsky there, who leads our Asia energy coverage, and we continue to monitor the reaction to these markets. So much uncertainty is what we're dealing with at the moment when it comes to that power vacuum in Iran and what happens next, how elongated this conflict is going to be, the extent of U.S. involvement, many, many questions. And one market we will be watching is China. That's down to the dependence on crude oil from the Gulf. Earlier we spoke with Clayton Siegle, who's a senior fellow in the Energy and Security Climate Change Program at CSIS.
I think China has an outsized concern here. I would imagine that strategists in Beijing are really concerned at what they're seeing because they depend on substantially 45% of their imports of crude come from the Gulf. Almost all Iranian does go to China, and they're just coming off the heels of this whole episode in Venezuela. And they were taking all of that crude before it was diverted by the United States. So they're seeing Washington use energy as leverage in various theaters around the world that are potentially compromising China's energy security supply chains. It's got to be a concern, and they're going to have to pay more for their oil going forward.
Take a look at how we're setting up when it comes to China, as well as more regional assets coming on board with mainland China and Hong Kong as well as Taiwan in focus. Unsurprisingly, we are seeing investors broadly taking a pretty defensive view as we get into trading this Monday. Perhaps those losses are a little bit more capped than expected, but the focus really is on energy, with, of course, China seen as being one of the really net losers as a major oil importer. When it comes to the diplomatic side, though, Beijing has criticized the US and Israeli attacks on Iran, warning that they risk plunging the Middle East into deeper instability and undermining international law. Let's bring our China correspondent Min Min Lo, who joins us in Beijing. And Min Min, take us through the response that we've had from Beijing.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting responses is that it is further entrenching the relationship between China and Russia, because one of the first phone calls that Foreign Minister Wang Yi had made to a foreign leader was to Sergei Lavrov, the Foreign Minister of Russia, because these two countries see Iran as a counterbalance to the US. And as your guest mentioned earlier, this is an energy security threat to China. And here you can see a quote from Foreign Minister Wang Yi saying it is unacceptable for the US and Israel to launch attacks against Iran in the midst of negotiations, to blatantly assassinate a leader and to incite a regime change. And yes, China will be watching very closely for the emergence of any new power in Iran to ensure that the new regime will not necessarily be fully aligned with the United States. And of course, this also adds a layer of complication to the upcoming Trump-Xi summit, because President Trump is expected to come to Beijing in a couple of weeks' time. And how can China roll out the red carpet for a man who has helped bring about this attack on Iran, an act that China has condemned, has said it is a violation of the sovereignty of Iran? So this certainly complicates things here, although some analysts are saying that Iran simply is not important enough on China's agenda for it to sacrifice the relationship with the US, given that the US-China trade relations is still one of the most important ones for China to stabilize, especially at a time when this week the National Parliament here in Beijing will be meeting to discuss the economic priorities of the year.
Min Min, thank you so much for breaking it down for us. Bloomberg's Min Min Lo in Beijing. Now, our next guest is Rana, ST Lee Chair in U.S. Asia Relations at Harvard Kennedy School. Rana, it's good to see you. So We've just been talking with our correspondent about the implications for China. I wonder here, what is your read on the situation and the extent in which perhaps China can influence Iran at this stage to not formally block the Strait of Hormuz?
China is going to complain very strongly about the attack. Hi, just to check, you can hear me okay, yes? Okay. So
yes, we hear you.
I think
Thank you.
That's
Go
right,
ahead.
that China is... Okay. So I think it's fair to say that China will be protesting very hard verbally about the attack on Iran, but it's going to have two major issues behind the scenes that it's going to push very hard on. One is to try and persuade Iran not to block the Straits of Hormuz for the reasons that your two previous correspondents have pointed out, that huge amounts of China's energy needs are supplied from Iranian oil through the Straits of Hormuz, and it could be very damaging indeed to China to lose that supply.
What are you watching in terms of the potential for this to derail what we see from the Trump-Xi meeting at the end of this month, now that the U.S. has taken out what's seen as a close friend of the Chinese president? Does this affect what we might expect out of the U.S.-China summit?
I think that actually we're still likely to see this China-US summit go ahead in the same way, because there are various issues, including tariffs, the status of Taiwan, which China would like to have direct communications with President Trump about. And those won't go away just because of the current situation. What I think that they will do is to try and make sure the situation in the Middle East does not go any further out of control than it is at the moment. I think they'll also be in communications with the Saudi government. They're aware that the Saudis essentially appear to have signed off, given tacit permission for this attack on Iran. China, I think, will want to make sure that oil supplies in the Middle East remain strong and steady in terms of supplying China, but they, I think, are not.
We do have some, of course, breaking news at the moment. Lots of questions as to domestically some of the pressures that we're seeing for President Trump. We are hearing potentially that the ABC reporting two sources talking about the resolution vote on war powers could potentially happen likely on Thursday. On a call with Republicans on Sunday, House Speaker Mike Johnson telling lawmakers that vote on the war powers resolution is likely to be held on Thursday. Two sources telling ABC News about that. There, of course, have been lots of concerns domestically within the Democrats and also within even Republicans about the sustainability of the U.S. conflict and war operations going forward without the approval of Congress. So we'll continue to monitor that vote, but of course, at the same time, we continue to see this ongoing. And Rana, we've just been talking about President Trump's, of course, foreign policy agenda is so much more complicated now than it was even just a few days ago. And in a lot of ways, it goes against his campaign promises, what he spoke about in the State of the Union just last week about bringing peace, about no more wars, a more isolationist foreign policy for America. Are there some ways in which this is sort of handy for Beijing? Because we've seen in previous years, American distraction in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, has led to really more ability for Beijing to be able to build out its influence and assets across the Asia Pacific.
Yep. I think that it is fair to say that Beijing will want to portray itself as being a stabilizing influence in the world. It's basically been putting out major messages through the United Nations, through other institutions over the last year, that the US is the major disruptor. And it will look at the attacks on Venezuela and now on as examples of how global order is being overturned as they will see it through the United States. So I think that in the global south in particular, this is likely to lead to a great deal of capability for Beijing to make its case that it is the preserver of the new international order. And I think that that case will be made all the way up to the summit that's going to take place between the US and China in April in Beijing. That said, I don't think Beijing will do anything to actually disrupt the working of that summit. They're keen to have that meetings between President Xi and President Trump, and overall, they don't want anything to get in the way of that very important bilateral meeting.
Rana, really great to have you with us. We appreciate you working through those technical issues with us. Rana Mitter, ST Lead Chair in US-Asia Relations at Harvard Kennedy School for what's at stake when it comes to Beijing. More ahead here on the Asia Trade. This is Bloomberg. Take a look at some of the transport names that we're seeing, both air and sea, and really it is a lot of downside when it comes to these airlines, as expected. The double whammy, both of the potential for higher jet fuel prices, particularly impacting those that are unhedged. We'll be watching, of course, some of those later on in the session. But taking a look at Qantas, we're off those session lows, but still that disruption when it comes to planes getting grounded, disruptions and cancellations still playing out for Asian airlines there. Some upside when we're looking at some of the transport names, particularly trading in Japan. We're seeing more LNG tankers, for example, being diverted from the Strait of Hormuz in what is becoming really a widening crisis for energy transport, not just for energy and oil crude supply there. Well, the conflict has thrown global air travel into chaos. We've seen airspace closed over the region, major hubs in Dubai, Doha, Abu Dhabi all suspending operations. Bloomberg's Paul Allen joins us now with more. So it's interesting seeing the announcements from these airlines. They're sort of, day by day is how they're taking this.
Very much so. Uncertainty, the word of the moment here, because nobody knows how this is going to unfold. But already we've had strikes or a person killed at Abu Dhabi airport, a strike in Dubai as well. So Dubai is the world's busiest international airport now. The United Arab Emirates Civil Aviation Authority saying 20,000 passengers have been affected. Seems a little conservative when you consider 95 million passed through Dubai International last year. That's about 10,000 passengers per hour. So this has a knock-on effect as well, because now crews and planes are not in the right place to get onto connecting flights. So air travel around the world is going to be impacted by this, and it's hard to say for how long and how it's going to unfold as well. And then there's the question as well about the impact of rising fuel prices on airlines. A lot of airlines run hedging programs like Qantas, Singapore, Cathay Pacific, Japan Airlines. They're probably better positioned to weather this than a number of others, but other airlines don't. The big three airlines in China do not run a hedging program. Indigo in India doesn't. It also has to contend with a weak rupee. So some of these air stocks are going to have an interesting ride over the coming few days and weeks.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because following on from the pandemic, we saw some of these carriers choosing not to continue their hedging policy. But I wonder as well, given how we are hearing that the IDF is starting to strike targets in Lebanon, Hezbollah saying that it launched rockets, drones at Israel, according to the AFP, in terms of perhaps not just the airspace closures. What else are we seeing in terms of the impact on shipping and logistics in the region?
Well, we've been talking a lot this morning about the Strait of Hormuz, haven't we? The most discussed waterway on the planet right now, and it's only 33 kilometres wide at its narrowest point. And Iran has threatened to close that in the past, but you have to wonder, does it actually have to do so? Just generating anxiety around it seems to be enough at the moment. We're seeing shipping traffic through the Strait and the Persian Gulf slowing to a trickle. We've talked a lot about oil tankers, but it's containers and logistics as well that are staying away. And you've got to bear in mind also the US Navy is in the area. It's saying ships should stay 30 nautical miles away from its assets. So not a great time to be trying to operate a shipping company in the area. So MSC Mediterranean is not taking bookings for the Middle East at the moment. Moller-Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, they have suspended all crossings in the Strait, and Hapag-Lloyd now charging a war risk premium of $1,500 per container. And then it spreads beyond that as well, because the Houthi rebels in Yemen have started talking about targeting ships again using the Red Sea, which of course links to the Suez Canal. And even the French shipper CMA CGM is charging a $2,000 risk premium for just going through the Suez Canal. So raising a lot of questions about logistics going forward, particularly if we see ships having to take the long way around the bottom of Africa.
Paul, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Paul Allen, and to his point about some of the action we've been seeing from Iranian proxies. Again, Hezbollah has said that it has struck in retaliation over the Iranian leader's assassination and is claiming attacks on Israel. We've been hearing as well how they have been striking these Israeli targets at a time where the IDF has been recently striking targets in Lebanon. So you're seeing those volleys in either direction, Haidi.
There's a lot going on across the region, right? We are also hearing some confirmation from the UK saying that there's a suspected drone strike that hit the RAF Akrotiri base in Cyprus. We're waiting for more details on that, but we did hear reports and video, in fact, that was released just over the past few hours. Cypriot officials had denied those reports that 2 missiles were launched by Iran towards the island and intercepted. We're now hearing that the UK suspects that a drone strike hit that particular site in Cyprus. So a lot for investors to contend with at the moment. We are seeing that classic haven play, of course, gold being bid up. We're also seeing some demand when it comes to the dollar. Risk-off currencies like the Aussie are a little bit softer today. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Take a look at how markets are tracking, particularly, of course, front and centre on energy prices at the moment. That spike in oil surging by the most in 4 years, but coming off a little bit as we continue to watch for the latest developments on these strikes on Iran, retaliation from Iran onto Israel, as well as the broader region. We're now hearing of strikes being traded between Hezbollah and the IDF at this point, as well as potentially a suspected drone strike in Cyprus as well. That is it for the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.